Before we start today's interview, please allow me a word or two about our podcast. Even as Myanmar plunges into a civil war because of the military's bloody coup, the international community and media organizations have all but turned their backs on the country and its people. But this humble platform is committed to staying the course. We conduct nuanced, long-form interviews with a variety of guests connected to Myanmar so our listeners can better understand the ongoing crisis. Thank you for choosing to spend the next couple of hours with us today. For this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast, I'm back with Jack Myint. This is the second part of our conversation. For those listeners who've not yet heard the first part, we definitely encourage to go back and take a listen. It was quite interesting. The first part left off where we were talking, basically starting the story when Jack was just 4 or 5, 6 years old and he was practicing his English at Shwedagon Pagoda and took it through his private school education, through his experiences at the American Center, which both of which provided greater understanding and access to the world, looking at political rhetoric and oratory, as well as his experiences with his monastic tutor and learning more about Burmese Buddhism. A lot of really good stuff in there. In this interview, we're going to kick it off from where we left off last time and look at what brought him to the US, what he's been doing in the US, as well as starting to uncover and look a bit deeper into some of his perspectives with the transition period, along with what's happening in post-coup Myanmar, and try to understand that better. There's a lot of good stuff coming, and I really appreciate you, Jack, for making time yet again for us to have these conversations. I know how busy you are, and to take time out of your globe-trotting schedule to come and sit down with us and share your voice to our audience. You have a lot of really valuable insights and perspectives to offer, and I just really thank you again for this time.
Thank you, Joa, for having me back on the show, and more importantly, for bearing with my long-windedness.
Oh, please be long-winded again this time, and let's get right to it. So, we left off as you were discussing some of the access that the American Center was starting to provide you, books you'd never read before, conversations that could now satiate some of your curiosity. I don't know if there's more you wanna pick off the bone of that experience, as well as what brought you to your first encounters and experiences with the West.
Absolutely. No, I think that that's a great place to start, and perhaps I could go into what that experience exposed me to. And this was around 2008, 2009, when an opportunity came up within offered by the State Department, a program called the Southeast Asia Youth Leadership Program, CELP, which is a precursor to what many know now as YSEALI and other youth development initiatives, which really expanded under the Obama administration. But this was a relatively new program, and I was selected through recommendations and many engagements I've had at the American Center to participate in that program. It took me to the United States for a month, and it was an eye-opening experience, opportunity to engage with various like-minded youth leaders from across Southeast Asia, as well as to engage with local American students, professors, to some degree, U.S. government officials, think tankers, and the likes. So the program took me for 3 weeks at at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, Illinois, and then a week in Washington D.C., where we took a few meetings with the East Asia Pacific Bureau, Educational Culture Affairs Bureau, et cetera, et cetera. So this is my first time getting on an airplane, right? So the first time out to the United States, and I was just enthralled by the experience, the whole thing. I mean, sitting in on college classrooms the first time and seeing the interactive nature of how students and teachers interact, I suppose, it's like it's a conversation, not so much as you digest whatever I tell you and regurgitate it back to me at the exam. No, no, no. This was real conversation. This was debate. This was, retort and at times argument, and they're all so comfortable in it. That was the part that amazes me the most, especially um, even in private school, in Myanmar, there are certain cultural and certain norms where you don't um, go one on one, and you certainly don't interrupt the professor, which I still think is bad behavior, if you will. But no, here people were comfortable, and people just seemed, especially in the classroom, right, the free flow of ideas. Joe, I was hooked. That was it. I was like, this is where I want to come back. This is where I want to study. Um, I knew then, and then of course a week later, I was in DC, and um, we met with several individuals within State Department, and we also met a few think tankers. And one meeting particularly stood out in that the Asia Foundation hosted us, and one of its leadership, a gentleman named John Brandon, who was um, an alum of Northern Illinois University, hosted this entire delegation of really high school students from Southeast Asia, and spoke to us about his outlook towards Southeast Asia opportunities, how he got into the study of Southeast Asia, etc. And I remember during Q&A, I raised my hand and I asked this question when I said, "Well, what do I do if I want to sit where you're sitting 20 years
Mm,
from now?"
mhm,
And he said, "Learn to stay in touch and learn to keep in touch, because your net worth really comes down to your network."
mhm,
That stuck with me. That
mhm,
really stuck with me. I
mhm,
From the time I came back, and I think it also is further exacerbated by my earlier experience of encountering so many friends, I would say, as they become through many letters we send each other, my pen pals, right, with
mhm,
people from all across the globe. And I'm like, oh, I could do that. I actually quite like doing that. Right.
mhm,
And um and yeah, so I kept um the well, Rolodex is an exaggeration, but a small handful of business cards, I should say, that I collected from
mm,
that trip. And I just started writing to people on a regular basis, just to keep them updated. Say, hey, I'm back in Yangon now. I'm, going to 10th grade. I'm doing this, that, and the other. And it's not like,
mhm,
every day sort of messages. It's like every Christmas you send them a note with a little update on what's new with you and inquiring them about their health and their families. And, um, maybe at least half the people you write back, and now you have an email chain and a back and forth. And I was fortunate to have people who were kind enough to actually give a hoot what a 14-year-old from Burma
mhm,
had to say or what's going on in his life, right?
yeah,
But I did make friends through that and stayed in touch with folks that I met during that program, including the professors, which were instrumental um, as I take the next step in my journey, education journey, that is. And back in Myanmar, I went back to public school to finish the matriculation exam. That was a bit of a reverse culture shock, as you would say, because we you go from a private school, which yes, the culture is there, but at least there's some degree of independence and free flow of thought, if you will, that is not as heavily scrutinized. Um, and I remember first month in private school, sorry, in public school, back in public school, um, the one of the fellow students from the American Center had a few printouts. They're like sticker size printouts of pictures of Aung San Suu Kyi and General Aung San together, sort of like with a caption that says "like father, like daughter." And I thought that was
Mhm.
so, and I wanted one of those, so I asked him
Mhm.
for it, and you know, I loved it so much. He perhaps stupidly uses it as a bookmark on in my
Mhm.
books. What I had forgotten was I one of the textbooks that I was using required showing your homework on the book itself, so I just submitted it to the teacher, and I remember being called in to the well. At first, the teacher said, "Well, that she found very problematic and illegal material in one of the textbooks that
Mhm.
could cause whoever owns it in huge trouble." Immediately, as soon as she said that, that fear of holy crap, am I going to end up in jail? Because yeah, I mean, it's technically, doesn't matter if you're 14 or 40. Holding on to that material is punishable by up to 7 years in prison, bar none, or distribution of that material for that matter. Um,
Mhm.
and she didn't reference what it was. She just said, you know, whoever did this knows. I know who you are. You know who you are. Um, Stay after class and we'll talk. And I swear to God, that whole day, I thought she was going to report me to the police or hand me over. But they kept my cool. By the end of the class, very subtly stuck around um, and went to her office, and she actually gave it back to me. And she said, "Look, I know how you feel. I feel it too. But
Mhm.
we're both here. We're both closely monitored. So don't do something stupid like that ever again.
Mhm.
And figure out a way to toss it." So she handed that back to me. She did not do it herself, which is symbolic in itself, right? Like it's either, she could have punished, she could have showed, or tried to, uh, share the junta's propaganda spiel with me, and or she could have done whatever she wanted, but it was in that moment that you realize that you're living in fear, but also bound by that same mutual respect that you have
Yeah.
towards the lady.
Yeah.
That the junta can try all they want, all they can to impose all kinds of draconian rules and laws, but this teacher um, did not have the heart to dispose of it herself. She just
Mm.
simply couldn't do it. Right.
Yeah.
And she just very coyly slid the book back to me and said, just don't do that again, and that
Mhm.
was it. um, so I thought that was a worthy anecdote to share. I
Yeah.
pretty much breezed through public school, and in that I mean, I was not a great student, but I was not a bad student either. Very mediocre student. I finished my matriculation. um, did not, I kept my head down because in the first month on the offset, you're getting a very, very clear reminder that, hey, you're not protected by the private school system anymore. You're in the system governed by this military under their Ministry of Education. One wrong move, and who knows what can happen to you.
Mhm.
That awareness is there and has always been there. Um, so I didn't engage much. I didn't push back that much, or nor did I engage in debate, but because I had that outlet at the American Center. I'll go there in the evenings after school, and I can vent, and I can talk about what I felt and ask questions that I wanted to know the answer to. um,
Mhm.
wherein during during the day school, I just kept my mouth shut and kept my head down and
Mhm.
finished matriculation. And right after matriculation was, what's next, right? I got enough score to go into university. Most universities are choice except medical. I got into engineering school and all that. But uh, my mother, knowing me, And knowing my, as she calls it, my big mouth, she said, "Well, you're going to either get killed or end up in jail. So you're getting out of the country one way or another. And I don't know how you're going to do it, but you're going to do it."
Mm.
So, and I've always wanted to. And I said, "Well, I want to go
Yeah.
to America," I told her. And she said, "Well, it's not cheap. So if you can figure out a way to do it yourself, by all means, right?" As luck would have it, that was also around that time when there was so much internet outages across the country.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
I didn't have the usual, tools. Even the common application was a hit or miss, really. It was more just books that you found at the American Center. And back then, the internet connection to the American Center was one of the worst because people kept
Mhm.
using it for Google Talk and VZO chat and all those earlier day
Uh-huh.
chat rooms. So it was very slow. And so I said, all right, you know what? I'm just going to handwrite my applications. So I downloaded the Common application, printed it out, and got one of my American Center teachers to write me a recommendation waiving that application fee, and I hand wrote all my applications to 23 colleges and universities, and I sent them in. I mailed them out, all of them, um, with my test scores and all that, of course, the TOEFL, SAT, etc. Right. So the I got into 18 of those colleges and universities. The source of where I drew that from was there was this old, and it's a little bit outdated. It's a Princeton review of best 373 colleges in the United States. That was really it. I just looked at the numbers, looked at what schools have strong programs. But really, even then, there wasn't much information. Sometimes you just look at what does this sound good is really about what it comes down to, right? I knew
Mhm.
that through some of the teachers at American Center. Liberal arts education, um, gives you the option of choice, that you're exposed to a breadth of um, education, a breadth of subjects and topics, which I like. I like to, you know, have that option to be able to dabble before you decide, okay, I'm going to be this major. Right? But I always knew that politics was going to be a part of it. But politics is so broad that it could be anything. It could be
Mhm.
any specialty field that you pick, and then with an interlude in politics. So it's, you know, I landed on my remaining four or five schools, and I got good scholarships, more than half covered, right? But then the big question is, even with more than half covered, I needed I still needed money to make it work. Really, what we're looking at is a full ride plus, right? Because by then, I took the English language test, the TOEFL and IELTS, and I remember IELTS getting a band score of 8.5 out of 9, which is at that time a bit of a rarity in the country, and now we have seeing a lot more 8.5s come out. The same thing with TOEFL, very high score. So I was able to market that a little bit and was starting to generate my own income, going to teach, either fellow students or even people much older, just how to ace the TOEFL or how to ace the IELTS, or both English language tests, and so I was making decent money, um, more than a average or entry level government worker for sure. And that was one of the primary sources of income for the household, especially after my father developed a chronic condition, neuromuscular disorder, and my mom, his full time caretaker. So their retirement savings, shaky as it is, plus mine, helped us going. So it was a matter of, okay, well, if I go this added this loss in income plus other costs, how we're going to manage that was the big question mark. And there were five schools at the end of the 18 I got into that where I was negotiating, back and forth and back and forth, that by until mid-June there was no clear picture of which school was going to, you know um, go ahead and say, okay, well, we'll take a chance on you. Come on over, right? And internet was just so shoddy. And I remember this. This was June June 14, um, my birthday, and I just thought it would be. It was getting frustrated, and the connectivity was bad, and emailing was bad. So I went to the nearest internet cafe, and I called up one of the colleges just to their switchboard, and I said, "I'm calling from Burma." What I wanted to say was, "I would like to speak with the admissions office, please." But the operator didn't even skip a beat. As soon as I said I'm calling from Burma, he's like, "All right, hold on," and then transferred me, and it ended up at the president's office. So they said, "But
Mm.
the president's office, how can we, direct you?" And I said,
Mhm.
I said, if I'm on a call at the president's office, you lose 100% of the shots you don't take. I said, "Well, if
Mhm.
I go 5 minutes of her time, I'm an accepted student, and I like to speak with the president." And they're like, "Okay, patching you through." So that went through, and I just may have spent 30 minutes talking to the president of the college, and made an appeal to her, and shared with her my story, and why I wanted to come outside to study, and the various difficulties that we're facing, and you know um, in Myanmar regarding internet connectivity, as well as political freedom of thought, etc. Um, what I intended was a 5 minute conversation turned out to be a 40-minute one, and I can tell you, my
Mm.
mother was not happy with that phone bill.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
with her and the support of the international recruitment director, who really, really took a chance on me and went out of her way to convince the financial aid board and the admission board, really all of the president and that admissions director, both, they really worked hard to make it possible. And by early July, and you have to start school by August, September, right? So it was pretty close. I mean, everyone had even bought their, you know, air tickets, and I haven't even gotten my visa interview yet.
Mhm.
And then the letter came back in that, okay, we'll cover all costs on the condition that when you are here and have access to internet and all other resources, that you will apply for supplemental private scholarships throughout your term at the college.
Mhm.
And that was it. um, I was also given a part-time job, which allowed me to partially send back money home, which is important to my parents, and for my for my own peace of mind. I didn't want to just leave everything behind and go. Um, and and yeah, so I was in, and after that, freshman year, that was when I got there, and I, true to my word, I applied for college, for additional scholarships, and um, all three that I applied came through. One with the State Department, one with the um, Open Society Foundation, and another one with Prospect Burma Scholarship, which was established with funds from uh, Aung San Suu Kyi's Nobel Peace Prize Fund. So when she won the prize, she didn't touch a dime of that money, and instead set up an education trust, and Prospect Burma received a chunk of
Mm.
um, that endowment.
Mhm.
So it worked out in the end, but it was a a gut wrenching process
Mhm.
altogether. But um, and then I got here, and I think 3 months in, I heard about Aung San Suu Kyi coming to the U.S., and that she was going to be in Washington receiving the Congressional Gold Medal. Um, I didn't even think twice. I didn't have an invitation. I didn't have any place to stay. I just hopped on the next Greyhound available to go to Washington in hopes
Oh,
of
wow.
getting a glimpse
Yeah.
of her. Just
Uh-huh.
and I was 17 by that point.
Mm.
17. I just got on a Greyhound, and as luck would have it, um, my godfather, as you may have recalled from part one, and
Mhm.
who's also a monk leader, was one of
Mhm.
the invited guests,
Mm.
and he was staying at a monastery, so he was kind enough to let me crash on the floor, on the sofa, um, and then we went to I accompanied him the next day, and he just at one point, this is an invite only guest list. At one point, he just grabbed my hand and said, "All right, we're going in." And then we went in
Mm.
right to the Capitol Rotunda. and we sat 3 lines away from where um, Senator McConnell, Speaker Boehner,
Mhm.
Secretary Clinton, um, Leader Pelosi, all together came to honor Aung San Suu Kyi with the Congressional Gold Medal Award. It was a life-changing event, and I've already been hooked the, the to the DC environment when I first got there a week ago. But this was next level. Right? You can feel the this atmosphere of
Uh-huh.
change. Just this all happening so fast. Things in government reforms, all of that happening. And so the it was, let's just say, it was. I think a lot of Myanmar citizens share this sentiment too. When we look at Aung San Suu Kyi, which is why it's so hard at times to be able to be uh, objective when we
Uh-huh.
analyze her political flaws. Is
Uh-huh.
you look at her and you see someone that looks just like you. You see someone of your kind being looked up to by the rest of the world. That doesn't
Mhm.
happen as often for your average Burmese. We're either looked at with pity, or uh, you know, if you're on the other side of the spectrum, where you're colluding with the junta, and it doesn't matter how rich you are, you're still looked at with disgust and disdain everywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
Uh, and I most certainly noticed the look of, oh, poor you, in all the
Uh,
best intentions. I have no doubt about that.
uh-huh.
But that
Uh-huh.
poor you thing with her, that wasn't it. With her,
Uh-huh.
people were looking up to her. They wanted to hear what
Yeah.
she has to say. They wanted to draw their own sense of inspiration and her ideas into their way of life. That was the first time you see someone
Mm.
with your, with who share your nationality being on top of the global stage.
Yeah.
And that was something that nothing and no one can compete with. That's why she has this, I think, almost unanimous appeal across the country. Well, with the exception of the military, of course, and
Mhm.
they resent her. Well, and for in their case, the source of their resentment is that everywhere they go, they're am I going to get to sit at the table? Am I going to be told to wait outside? I mean, even within the ASEAN context, it's happening to this day, right? The
Yeah.
military never got the level and degree of respect from the rest of the civilized world that
Yeah.
she does, bar none. Right? It's not even a comparison.
Mhm.
So I think that I saw that, and I was very I was encouraged to do more and do better in college, and continue. And freshman
Mm.
year, I wanted to um, get a get come back to DC when I had the opportunity to work. The school had a scholarship that allows folks to work during the summer. There was a small grant available, and but as you know, DC internships are competitive, and no one wants to hire a freshman, especially not a freshman straight out of Burma. But you may recall this gentleman who I asked that question several years back at the Asia Foundation. I said, what do I do if I want to sit in your chair in 20 years? Well, I called him up, and John Brandon was my first entry into um, my DC network. And to this day, the contacts he helped made have been have proved useful. And I asked him, I just straight up asked him for, well, first, if there are any openings at the Asia Foundation, which is the only, you know, n- outside of U.S. government organization that I knew in the in the DC circuit. Um, and he said, well, you may be a little bit too young, but um, why don't I put you in touch with some people around DC? And in the DC Southeast Asia policy circle, as small as it is, so he put me in touch with several people. And at the end of each meeting, and we had everybody wanted to talk Myanmar, It was also very new. It was so exciting. Right? Everybody was kind enough to share their time. Um, and whenever I concluded a meeting, the first thing I asked them is, if you don't mind, I would be grateful if you would put me in touch with three people, at least three people, um, who would be, beneficial for me to speak with, who, just like you, are, active in this Southeast Asia field across the U.S. and Washington in particular. And from that, it grew, right, from three more, and then three more, and it grew, and eventually, by the time summer came around, I had two internship offers, which one of which I took with the U.S. ASEAN Business Council.
Mm, right. So that's your journey to an American university and then to DC and then to being able to find a way to stay in DC and to do more work there. And I want to get ahead into how that developed into how you converted that and leveraged that into your current situation. Before we do though, I just want to go back to Aung San Suu Kyi because it's really so valuable what you're sharing. And I think that right now, Aung San Suu Kyi to some degree, speaking in 2023, a word that comes to mind in thinking about her is indefensible. That may or may not be true depending on what side of the line you're on, but certainly in the public sphere, wherever you're from, it's very hard to be a fervent Aung San Suu Kyi defender and supporter today with the knowledge of the role that she would play after house arrest. And and when I say indefensible, I'm talking this is more of a non-Burmese view. Obviously, these are those that are following the country from afar. People might make excuses or they might have justify some things, but there are certain parts of a record that are just really hard to get around. And I think that for those that haven't grown up there and known the suffocating sense of the what the military has done, the pitying nature of when you go outside the country, how people look upon you, and that justifiable criticism of Aung San Suu Kyi today negates who she was and how she was seen in the backdrop and the context of what was going on there and what she was coming from. And these are really hard things to pick apart because, the often the narrative, especially when it comes to Burma, becomes much more simplistic, black and white, you're this or you're that. And so to even start down a path today of admiring or appreciating certain of Aung San Suu Kyi's qualities, you're immediately walking into a danger zone of being labeled an apologist because you are not leading with or underscoring her role in the Rohingya crisis, which should not be avoided and should definitely be something that is given its fair share. But people are complex. Situations and countries' histories are also complex, and it does a service to be able to understand the nuance and the complexity of these things to a greater degree, even when we're looking at very hard and challenging situations, to be able to understand that nuance and those particular sides, even when it might make us uncomfortable. And so I say all that because I think it's really valuable to get this fuller picture, not just of Aung San Suu Kyi, but kind of like what she represented and how people saw her and how, and one thing that's been said about Aung San Suu Kyi, which I think is quite true, is that whether one was Burmese or foreign, many people seem to use her to tell the story they wanted to tell and to see in her what they wanted to see and to have her embody that, which is when, she was under house arrest and not speaking for herself, that was quite easy to do. You can write whatever story you wanted of her and there really was not much else that can get out there. But I wonder if you could just go back into describing what the figure of Aung San Suu Kyi represented in that environment and describing it in such a way that is able to educate a foreign audience, knowing that there's a foreign audience listening that is skeptical, distrustful, even betrayed by her later actions, which we're not taking away and we'll get into later in the conversation. But to balance that picture of her uh, coming from the country and out into the world what was it that she represented? What was it that she spoke in her image and her example? How did that speak to you or ignite something in you?
Right. Thank you for that very thoughtful question, and I think I think you hit the nail right on the head with this with your earlier assessment. It is true. She is a projection of what people envisions her to be, right? Because she was not able to be out for so long. So, is she a woman's rights icon? Sure. She's a freedom and democracy icon? Sure. Prisoner of conscience. I mean, you can attach any label to the person, and the reality is, and we've known this through history and time through time again, that the real version of a person will always disappoint the version you've built up in your head. That's that's simple. Um, and for us Burmese, I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's, at least in our generation, there's no one like her. There's no one at that level of brilliance, sophistication, worldliness, and recognition. Really, just bringing and keeping Myanmar on the map, right? For a country that would have otherwise been forgotten. Um, and to this day, I mean, I still get people question where, and I have to, bring out the map and say, right between China, India, all that. So for that, as a person, she will always have my respect, and I apologize to no one about that, because no one will understand what that woman meant to many uh, students, to many children, students, young adults, and even old people in Myanmar that have no one else. So I will never apologize for that. Now, in terms of her, ability as a politician, in terms of her maneuvers and the policies that she said or implemented, what she said, what she did not say, all that we can scrutinize, and we can form various criticisms on. And I myself am one of those people who would openly say, well, this is just flat out wrong. This is just bad policy. That's okay. And what she did as a politician, we can critique all day long. But as a person, what she represented to us, and what she, um, the glimmer of hope, right, that she gave to us, that no one, and I mean no one, can take that away from that.
Yeah.
I'll start with that. Now, in terms of what she was able to accomplish, I agree. A lot of the expectations fall short in her inability to implement, coalesce, and also to in her leaning too much on the personality politics, right? Uh, that to me was a major flaw in the overall leadership.
Uh-huh.
Instead of
Uh-huh.
spending enough time on building institutional power, focusing more on building personal power, or at least living off of that personal political capital, I thought was um, not long sighted. That said,
Mhm.
there are various deterrences, right, for her to be able. I mean, she's running on a handicap, with the military still maintaining, control of the parts of parliament, as well as key ministries in the cabinet. So that those are facts that everyone knows already. So I won't go
Uh-huh.
into the details, but imagine for a second, right? If you were in that role, though I don't think anyone could really imagine what it would be like to be in that role, locked up for
Mhm.
20 years, and thrown back in the stage, and given an illusion to lead, and expected to deliver in the same degree as what is determined as success by unclear and ever-changing Western standards. So you look at that and it's
Right.
like, oh wow, okay, well that's a tall order, you think. um, but
Uh-huh.
but number one, what I see in her is a person who has deep trust issues, and rightfully so. Rightfully so.
Uh-huh.
You don't know who to trust. You don't know who to surround yourself with, and a leader is as only as effective as the people he or she surrounds herself himself with. So in this case, I think surrounding herself with people that she thought she could trust, or
Mhm.
trusting people that um, came up together with her in the overall movement, spent time together in prison, etc., or have established their allegiance and loyalty to the NLD, pretty much giving their lives and freedom to the party and the cause, and are now out and equally um, committed, right? And the intention is there, the heart is there, but when in practicality the performance falls short, what do you do when the no
Yeah,
other alternative? You know that the
yeah,
technocrats
right.
mostly. Ones that know how to do are affiliated with the military regime, because in order to be able to know how to navigate the system, you've had to work with the regime for the past
Yeah,
6 decades. So figuring out who to trust and who to surround yourself with was a challenge, and rightfully
uh-huh,
so. And then purging based on pure performance, I think there are various other considerations. Again, of course, on paper, in a more theoretical aspect, well, these individuals partook in political activity, they knew the risks, and they were willing to take those risks. Therefore, you know, um, political um, political capture and the time they spend in jail should not be used as a means to sort of cash in, if you will, when
yeah,
the former opposition now in power. That is on paper. Yes, sure, of course, that's how it should be. But in reality, for lack of a better
mhm,
alternative, and also, loyalty within ranks, it was hard for her to be able to effectively lean on any individual group or groups of people. Um, I think that's the main handicap. No, those are, I should say, those are the main handicaps in
uh-huh,
the direction that she was going in. Um, and leaning, and the people that she did lean on, when they um, exaggerated reports, or where they misreport, misinterpret a situation for her. I mean, you're one person. You're not a demagogue. You're not going to have an all-seeing eye into every issue and problem.
uh-huh,
And I think that she made the biggest mistake of her career in betting on the domestic, in and that personal political capital, and the people who told her of the situation and wrote out the political math for her in the domestic sense. All of those elements, and her deciding, okay, that's the direction we're going to go. Uh, it was a risk she took. It was the choice she made. So, and I'm sure she's the type of person that wouldn't make choices or take actions if she doesn't believe it. So that's something that she'll have to live with for the rest of her life. But
yeah,
the fact remains, it's not one person, right? It's not one person. It's not you know all under the. It's while it may have the illusion of governance, the NLD government was fighting an uphill battle from the get go, in really maneuvering the state mechanisms of power, and the constant rifts with the military coalitions that I mean, I can we can do an entire episode on that, right? But bottom line was, uh, she did not build an effective coalition. She did not have the chance to build an effective coalition. Um,
mhm,
nor was she able to remove the person politics, because in the short term she needed to lean on that person politics to achieve what she thought took precedence. And in that process, institutions suffered, as well as a clear plan or mapping of new generation leaders that should have been cultivated with her at the helm.
yeah, I totally agree with you. This is something that you could spend an entire episode on, and more than that even. And I just have one follow-up question, and then we can move on with it. Everything you're saying makes sense in terms of what she was up against and how hard the how challenging it was to move into governing with the context of the military still having power and the problems the country is facing and everything else. And I think that it's one can be quite critical of what ended up happening, but there does need to be a closer look taken that doesn't necessarily excuse it and is not trying to be an apologist for it, but just fleshes out how incredibly challenging that context was. But the one question I don't know if that really covers that still remains is that decision of hers to, as you say, not build up an institution, not look for young leaders, but to really make a cult of personality and to really double down on it. I mean, to really invest in it. That there are a lot of personal anecdotes from that time, from diplomats and others, that have described in some detail how she surrounded herself by yes people, how she was not one to tolerate really dissent or would see. I mean, you yourself mentioned one of the first things you did to start this interview off was how exciting it was to be in an environment, a classroom environment in the West, where not only could you disagree with the teacher who was the authority, you could also interrupt them and you can carry on these conversations with people far above your station, and that critical dialogue is really appreciated here. And we see the exact opposite of that dynamic, where she is intentionally surrounding herself by people who are not going to be in, behind closed doors or in a public setting. They're not going to offer dissenting views, which is really an example of civil discourse, kind of town hall style, taking place, an open exchange of ideas. She really seemed to move away from that, and there it's also been reported that during, I mean, this is incredible, but during the NLD period, there was more. I can't remember the exact statistic. I want to say what I read was that there were more arrests of journalists during the NLD period than during the military regime. Certainly, there was not really an opening of press like those would have wanted, and there were still many journalists and institute media organizations that were being persecuted during the NLD times. And so you just kind of across the board, you don't see any kind of free exchange of information, of civil discourse, of different political ideas battling it out. You see her really investing in wanting to build to equate loyalty and patriotism with agreeing with whatever she did and whatever she said. And and I guess the question is, why did she do that? I mean, this is someone who is married to a someone from England, has spent time in substantial time in Western countries and Western academic institutions, fluent in English, fluent in ideas of Western democracy and everything else. This, I think, is one of several of the things that really surprised and shocked people. And what they were hoping or thought that she would be is this limitation of a free exchange of ideas and really investing and doubling down deep into following her and supporting her no matter what. So what's your understanding of why she went that way?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, how do you define or how do you explain how someone is as a person? As I said earlier, the proof is in the pudding, and our pudding had authoritarian tendencies, plain and
Uh-huh.
simple. Um, yeah, and those are. Let me just clarify here. Those are not qualities or degrees associated to any part of the world. I mean, they are authoritarian figures in the West as well. Some of
Sure.
whom have proved to be quite effective, right? Some of
Mhm.
whom have delivered on monumental developments that contributed to mankind. You can go back to history and look in the same way that a lot of people mention Lee Kuan Yew as an authoritarian leader in Singapore and the way that he
Uh-huh.
transformed the country, and also while building institutions with the cult of personality at the same time, right? So
Uh-huh.
it can be done. So
Uh-huh.
it's just a leadership style, or it's just how you are as a person. Again, I mean, we never knew who she was as a person, and the think the you reflect a lot of what you would like to see or what you would like in a leader on a person, and everyone has a different perspective of what you want to see in a leader. An assertive authoritarian leader is not necessarily a bad thing in our part of the world, right? And as
Mhm.
long as the doing good for a country component comes with it, and And
Right.
the litmus test of it is what, how the public responds, because their decisions impact day-to-day lives of their citizens. She places a lot of her policy importance on uh, her constituency, the base, the local Myanmar populace, and in the process, if it alienates her once avid supporters in the West, then so be it. That was her judgment call. Right? Um, I, I, I have my issues with that, and criticisms on how it could have been handled better. But everybody has their opinions on it, and in hindsight,
Uh-huh.
sure, I mean, it makes sense. And but that's not at all, my defense. This is not a defense of Aung San Suu Kyi, not at all.
Mm. Mhm.
Um, she made moves that where would be not what I would not like to see from a leader. No question about it, right? And some of those decisions were unsound. Some of them were morally questionable. Yes, but
Mhm.
again, you cannot inundate and take away that at our lowest point, there are few Burmese who was able to achieve as much as she did, or capture
Yeah.
the hope and imagination of entire generations the way that she did. We have
Yeah.
General Aung San, we have Uta at the UN Secretary as the UN Secretary General, and Aung
Mhm.
San Suu Kyi. There simply is not a whole lot. Well, actually, no one else who could
Yeah.
play at that level, who could break through the, say, regional level into the global level. That's the part, right? Like usually, everyone else, like, it's pretty insignificant if you think about it, right? In terms of um, their appeal, their standing, um, their name, and the name that it brings the country together with. So those two are, and in my opinion, should be kept separate, right? Which could also give you a glimpse into the psyche of why so many Burmese are still fervent supporters of her. But the issue there becomes, if you love someone, you love everything they do. In my case, that should not be the case, right? And I don't look at it that way. You
Yeah.
judge a politician based on the content and quality of their actions, plain and simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you bring the personnel into it, it messes with your objectivity. Um, as a person, the hope and just the sheer um, momentum, oh sorry, and just the sheer magnitude of her presence, what it gives us,
Uh-huh.
will always be there. As a politician, she did not make it to the mark of what one would expect by the matrix of a successful leader, granted with all her handicaps and the limitations that were placed on her government, but that those two should be judged separately. The problem with most Burmese is
Mhm.
once they love an individual, they're protective of everything that that individual
Mhm.
does, and in that process, having trouble distinguishing, the person from the action, and vice versa.
Well, I would say vice versa in terms of that's the same problem the West has. I mean, that's really interesting. I haven't thought about it this way before, but just as Burmese might develop a protection of the person who they admire, I think the opposite problem is in the West where the criticism and frustration towards Aung San Suu Kyi's actions have led many in the West to really be incapable of understanding why she was still a beacon for hope personally in terms of what she represented because they've defined her by her political actions, and it's very hard for us in the West, and it kind of reeks of being an apologist for many people to be able to understand this beacon of hope that she represented in a place that as you mentioned, one of 3 people, U Thant and her father, Aung San, that that suggested of a nobility, and it's hard for Westerners to appreciate why that still exists today when she was on the wrong side of a genocide. Um, the other thing I'd add to that Sorry, go
Why
ahead.
why would they take that added leap of effort when you have so many other icons to choose from? We don't have a choice. This is the one we got, right? Whereas okay, well, yeah, no, so it's, it's easy to cut and go when it's, when you're not tied to it by nationality or by history or by the circumstances of hardship. It's easy to cut and ditch, right? And and I don't blame them. That's how this is how human behavior works, and it should not be blamed. Why would
Right.
and to be honest, right? Why would anyone spend all the additional unless if you're really of the academia, or if you are affiliated with a country one way or another, then you take the extra time and effort to figure out and learn the nuances. But honestly, why would it? I mean, there got so many problems in this world. We're just
Yeah.
a small speck of dust in a much bigger geopolitical theater. So it's natural. It's natural for the general global audience perspectives to shift that way. And the onus is not on the public of the West, or the populations that previously supported her. The onus is on the the individual to manage those various support bases and the political capital that they hold. You
Mhm.
want to win something, you got to let go of something. And how do you balance those two? How do you keep your gains and losses in check? That's up to the person, right? In my opinion. And at the end of the day, you're in the field, you're playing politics. If you're playing politics, well, you got to play that too.
Yeah.
And and she knew that. I didn't doubt for a second that she was oblivious to that. She knew that, and she made the
Mhm.
call. That was a
Right.
choice.
Yeah. The other thing I would add to this that's quite interesting is when you're talking about Burmese names that on one hand are radiating back a certain kind of nobility uh and optimism and confidence among the people, while on the other hand are moving to a global stage and attracting a greater worldwide audience. Uh, you mentioned Aung San Suu Kyi, Aung San, and U Thant. Looking outside the political realm, and this is something I think does not get as much attention, I would also put some monastic names and names of and non-monastic Burmese who taught meditation on there as well. I know this is a somewhat different topic because we're not talking about unifying a country. Of course, the many non-Buddhist ethnic minorities that are there. We're not talking about a vision of how a society can advance. So it's somewhat different. But I think that when when one is talking about Myanmar in the international stage, often it is portrayed as, to use your words, in kind of pitying and these poor people, and that kind of viewpoint can limit or restrict the humanity. But the worldwide mindfulness movement, this had its roots in Myanmar. And when you're looking at teachers like Lady Sayadaw, who, as I mentioned before the interview, today is the 100th anniversary of the death of Lady Sayadaw. So it's a opportune time to be mentioning him. But along with him, Mahasi Sayadaw, Sayaji Ubakin, Goenka, Mogok Sayadaw, Sayadaw U Pandita, some of these names of these giants in the field of meditation and of Buddhism and monastics, as well as in Goenka's case, not only a non-monastic, but even a non-Bamar and a non-Buddhist even. These are teachers. These are not people receiving pity or aid. These are some of the highest and most revered and respected teachers of an exported version of a meditation that has transformed the world and especially transformed the West. When you look at what mindfulness is doing today, and how it's changing our society over here, and how it's from intensive meditation retreats to the far end and then to the other end of the spectrum, just having mindfulness in major corporations and the military. And that can be argued about the ethical nature of that, but mind versions of mindfulness and stress reduction in so many different forms, and so much of that came from Burmese teachers. So this might be somewhat off the track because I know that you weren't exactly getting at well, you were looking more at leaders of society and of the lay world and the political reality and such. But I just feel I'd be remiss not to mention these giant names that both were a sign of nobility and and praise within the country, and also being giant giants that were respected, and not just respected, but people came to learn under them outside the country, that I don't think it's really talked about enough in terms of the contribution that Myanmar's made to the world. And that's also very personal to you, because your monastic tutor who you referenced is you had a personal relationship but he's also in contemporary Burma. This is a monastic leader that has just been doing unbelievable things on a national level, in terms of that aren't just related to his knowledge of the Buddhist teachings and his ability as a monastic teacher, but also in how he's able to look at how the Buddhist teachings aligned with a democratic and inclusive society that is using his background as a monk and his knowledge of the Buddhist teachings to advocate for a better Myanmar. And in this particular case, your teacher is quite well known and famous within Myanmar. For those that know a lot about Myanmar, they also would have heard of him, not on a scale of some of those other teachers who really had foreign students that made a movement based on these teachings. But still, I think this is just something that should be acknowledged in this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, it warrants every mention and acknowledgement of what they did for Buddhism globally. But I'd like to point out is that there are two uh, categories here, right? What you're talking about in Bali is you separate them into logi, which is of the material world, and
Right, right.
logodra, which is of the immaterial world, which is of the beyond. The material world in which the continuing attachments that we have to uh, power, wealth, nationhood, nationality, all of that,
Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
The individuals that you mentioned, their very philosophy and teaching were a rejection of all those attachments, all the material attachments of the lay world, as you put it, um, and they that teaching, that mentality spread throughout. The matrix that would be because you can't compare apples and oranges, right? It's the same way. The matrix that you use in determining what they have achieved and accomplished, and the matrix that you use in more the realpolitik geostrategic spheres cannot be put next to each other. um, I don't think, because they're not playing this game. They're not playing the game that we are, or interested in the same things that we are.
Mhm.
They're interested in the beyond, and beyond just small matters of, um, well, being day to day needs and requirements that humans normally um, look at. So I think the realms are different, honestly, Joe, and in how you look at it. But yes, sure, 100% agree with you that their contributions and what they've done for Buddhism and the spreading of its core philosophy worldwide is something to be proud of. But because they rejected it, it's hard for us to attach the nationhood or nationality or something as ours to them, because the concept of ours, the very notion that they reject to begin with. Right? How do you claim their contributions as ours when they when they themselves have rejected it? The sense of the belonging and ownership to begin with. So just a thought.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that, but I think you'd have to go individually. I think if you're looking at, as far as I understand their biographies, someone like Mahasi Sayadaw or SN Goenka, you do see less engagement in the world and more of a focus on their meditative or Buddhist mission. But I think it's different. I don't think anyone can make the argument that Lady Sayadaw was renouncing the world or renouncing the social issues of the day, or even the things that he did, how they were reforming Buddhist society, Burmese society at the time. I think Sayadaw U Pandita definitely, I mean, Sayadaw U Pandita suffered tremendously from the ways in which he would not legitimize or honor a military regime. Those were smaller acts than really the level of engagement of a Lady Sayadaw. And then I don't know where you'd put your monastic tutor and where he fit in. This is, as I understand it, this is not so much a meditation master, a meditation teaching monk. but someone who, on one hand, was, I think you said that he was in charge of 20,000 students overall, but yet he was also doing a lot to promote different democratic values and inclusivity to the extent that I believe he's still in prison today for the work he did. And so these things do spill over. And I think if there's one um, hope or aspiration of what this platform has tried to do over the conversations we've had is to well, to say it another way, I think that when Myanmar is understood outside of the country and by different foreign actors, I think there can be a tendency to want to put things in categories and make firm, solid lines around, this is the political thing, this is the religious aspect and the clergy, and this is the meditative side, and here's the ethnic minorities, and to put things in these different categories. But I think that often when you're looking at how things play out, often those categories break down and they become dotted lines and very amorphous. And so I think in the cases of some of those monks I mentioned, I think yes, for sure, they did not so much engage in the world. But I think there's other examples of monks who certainly they're not a great political figure, and they're not playing the political game to the extent that a verified, bona fide politician is. But I mean, also to quote what you said last time, the sharp elbows of monastic politics are much shrewder than what you find in the Beltway. And I do think that they're both on the more progressive and on the more nationalistic side. There are those monks that are playing that game, but they're playing it in robes. And maybe it's, maybe you can't quite compare that across the board, as you say. But I don't know if I feel that for some of those monks, that it's quite as extreme as apples and oranges. That they're in the game, and the game is being played somewhat differently because of their hairstyle and choice of clothes, if you will. But
Yeah,
they
you
are, yeah.
categorize it in the sense of a powerful civil society organization with a religious bent. That's how you would categorize it.
Right. So, good to reference all this. Let's tie a bow in that and move on with looking at the time we have available. And let's switch tracks and go back to your story again. We took a bit of a detour to talk about Aung San Suu Kyi, which went into this discussion of some of the role of these monastic leaders. And let's go back to where we're at with your story, where you had just found a way to spend a bit longer in DC through your connections and hard work. So pick up from there.
Oh yes, and so got my internship at U.S. ASEAN Business Council, and it was a most exciting time. We had just um, brought a first ever U.S. business delegation to Myanmar, composing of some 40 leading blue chip American companies to look at investment opportunities there. It was 2 days after the initial lifting of sanctions in 2012 by then. And I was on that team. I was on that team working. It was a very junior staff slash intern, and it was, I mean, the excitement, the enthusiasm, it was infectious. Right? Back then, uh, uh, Aung San Suu Kyi was in parliament, and as the leader of the opposition, the Thein Sein government was fixated on reforms and engaging with the international community, particularly the West, and had promised that they would go through with free and fair elections in 2015, which there was still much skepticism over. But in that opening, um, there was a desire and interest to learn everything about the country. Some want to seek opportunities, some wish to um, know what life's like. 60 years closed off, cut off from the world. um, it was a very exciting time, and to me, I picked the investment and trade angle because I believe that it is through development, economic development, that we would be able to dig ourselves out of the hole that we've been dug into all these years of oppression and restriction of censorship have created culture of fear, hate, and just, you know, cut us out from the rest of the world. We couldn't compete at a global level or even a regional level for that matter. And that was something that I was most motivated to, and I think I reflect the sentiment of my generation when I say we're most motivated to try to recapture. You know, we didn't want handouts. We didn't want aid at this point anymore. We, it's like the old saying, right? You can give a man a fish a day, or you can teach him how to fish. And always, in this case, we wanted to learn how to fish. We wanted to do our own thing, have the capacity to be able to do our own thing, um, be able to compete regionally and globally, um, and that desire of open markets and free competition was greater than anything else at that time. And yeah, the fast development of all international investments or FDIs that flowed in the country was a testament that, oh, this is very plausible and within reach. The telecommunications sector, particularly, was one that really lit a spark for me personally. When I was growing up, you needed a special permit and license to have a cellular phone. And they also do a lottery system where if your name gets drawn and you win a cellular phone lottery, and then the markup on it in the black market is so high, it's like $2,000. You can sell that um, your contract back on the black market if you don't um, take it for yourself with a government rate. If you buy it on the black market, normally these phones go for $2,500 to $3,000. Sometimes as high as $5,000 earlier in the days when I was growing up. So from that to everyone having a smartphone or a cell phone within a matter of months, just overnight, it's changed, right? That to me, and of course with with Facebook being very prevalent at that time, every um, phone auto install with Facebook and internet availability, the connectivity, the fast pace of change that had taken place. That was incredible to watch. Um, and many other sectors followed. The banking sector opened up to include more private banks, and people were um, before we were a purely cash economy to everyone having their own debit cards and credit cards. And it was such an exciting time. And then 2015 rolled around, and we held our breaths and watched as the NLD swept a big win in a remarkable landslide. Uh, and then the, what will the military do? What will the Thein Sein guys do? Will they make a proper exit? Will they, refuse? I mean, that was always the back of our heads. But transition of power did happen. They did leave, and the NLD government came to power with an asterisk next to power because, as I said earlier, parliament is still, um, no matter, even if you win the entire parliament, you can't get the majority. The military still controls one third, and then um, the the cabinet, the key cabinet positions, still maintained by the military. So, but throughout it all, we figured out a way to engage and work with the NLD government. And I was particularly fortunate that by the time I, graduated college, and I, the NLD had just won, and I went to work at a trade and Myanmar centric advisory firm called Inlay Advisory Group, where we helped a lot of businesses enter the market, look at the sanctions regime, and advised um, on ways forward that when if Myanmar needs to open, it needs to truly open up. By 2016, early 2016, when I joined the U.S. ASEAN Business Council again, this time as a full-time staffer managing the Myanmar portfolio, they had lifted the Obama administration had lifted the remainder of sanctions previously in place, um, and by then Aung San Suu Kyi's government had come to power, and she had installed herself as the state counselor of the country. A role equivalent, as she said, was above the president. So, you know, I was fortunate that when she visited the country as state counselor, I was already in this role, and she knew the importance of uh, responsible global conglomerates, particularly Western, in this case, American conglomerates, and the role that they can play in helping shape Myanmar's economic trajectory. So decided to spend an evening addressing that group, and being the only Burmese at the council at that time, I was fortunate to be able to spend some time with her. And I still remember this so vividly. I walked up to her and I told her that I was uh, my education, my being here was made possible through her scholarship fund, and that if the timing and opportunity is right, that I would love to have the opportunity to serve in her government. Because at that time, all I wanted was to go back. I just wanted to go back. I wanted to be a part of that change. And she looked me right in the eye and she said, "For what? And what are you going to come back and contribute? If you come back with an empty cup, you'll take more than you give. No, no, no. We need people who have much to give. You
Mm,
just finished college. You need
mhm,
to stay here, get as much as you can. And
mhm,
you don't have to necessarily inside your country to help your country." I'll never forget that. She said that. And it was true. I had just started my role. What would I have been able to offer
mhm,
back in Myanmar?
mhm,
But then she turned around, she said, "But you can do one thing for me, is that if any of the NLD youth and any of our local CSOs and activists come through town, you can offer them your wholehearted help and support in helping them navigate Washington, and also, connect them to the right people. Remember, you must pay it forward." And so that was that. And I stayed on for the next throughout the entirety of the NLD administration. And every year I would go back home at least twice to engage with herself and her government, and had the opportunity to just work with really brilliant people who went back with their cups full. Those are the kinds that she wanted. And she got many of them. Many of them left high paying corporate jobs in the United States and elsewhere to go back, for pretty much no salary, really, or minuscule salaries, because they were interested in rebuilding that nation they so loved. And it was, like I said, it was infectious, and I had the unique privilege to work with many of them closely, especially on economic issues, the likes of Kobobonge, Gomea Bahe, um, Sean Turnell, a longtime Australian advisor, was one of them.
mhm,
To some degree, Winston Seon, and so forth, who were real visionaries in Myanmar's economic reform process. And their efforts and their innovative thinking and approaches has um, placed it on the right path. It didn't, quite take a U-turn, so to speak, on, because again, you have 50, 60 years of damage to repair, right? So, but they tore down what needed to be tore down and tried to build back a foundational ground. And of course, we all know how that got interrupted with the NLD second wind, and from there, a reversal of all the positive change that's been made, the military seizing power and
mhm.
setting us back, God knows how long, but at the very least, a few decades.
So, what were your views on this transition period? This is something that was kind of a wild west as it was happening, and I think there were also many different views, even at the time, on where this was going, and what was how much this was really an opening, and how much this was just made perhaps helping only a certain number of privileged people, and outlying territories of ethnic minorities and religious minorities. It was it was a very different story. And then with the transition period ending in the coup, uh, many. who were critical of this transition period were very fast to have a kind of "I told you so" of this is proof that this was not legitimate and this was trouble from the start and this is what I've been seeing the whole time. There have been others that have pointed to this assertion being unfair and looking and saying the transition wasn't perfect, but here are the things that it did, and again pointing to these very difficult circumstances and contexts in which they were operating. You were someone very closely following and involved and trying to support this transition effort. As you look back on it now from a position of post-coup Myanmar, how how do you look at what this transition period was? What's your opinion on it?
Well, I think in order to be able to run, you need to know how to walk. And in order to walk, you need to fall down a few times before you can properly do so, right? It's the same thing. Sure, was it perfect? Absolutely not. But how
Mhm,
how else are you going to make it work? You can't, from the get go, get everything right. That is unrealistic. And
mhm,
and the fact that an entire sovereign nation needs training wheels is preposterous. You know, you gotta learn, and you gotta learn from your trial and error.
mhm,
That's how I've always seen it. I mean, this is a very messy affair, and the way that things are structured, the way that the power bases are centered, and how the military is interwoven itself in all major economic interests and the core power centers. That's very hard to dismantle,
mhm,
uh, and it's a problem. At the end of the day, it is uniquely a Myanmar problem that the citizens of Myanmar, all ethnics, races, and religions, will have to come together to solve. And I think the larger looming problem that the country shares. Um, and I'll get into the ethnic and religion issue in a bit, but the larger
mhm,
looming problem was development, a
mhm,
challenge, right? We
mhm,
did not have enough capital. We did not have enough technology, skill, and capacity to be where we wish to be economically. That's the biggest problem and common factor that everyone shared. And at that time, the in order for it to reach there, you needed the legitimacy and I guess global appeal of a government to deliver that. And Aung San Suu Kyi at that time there was no leader of her caliber to deliver that. And as
mhm,
I said, we can scrutinize and debate all day about what she got it right and where she got it wrong, but at that time it was unanimous all across all groups and races and ethnic groups and religions that um, there's no one else to deliver this mandate. Simply put,
mhm,
right? Now, once she got in power, and how she handled ethnic affairs, how she handled religion affairs, and the rights of various groups to self determination and governance, that is a different story. And many folks will tell you that it was completely it was handled with a lot of flaws and a bad judgment, decision making, and to some degree, in effect, I agree with that assessment. Especially if you're looking at traditionally um, or own ethnic self-governed regions where she would go on and appoint Burma leadership, right? Burma chief
right,
ministers, cabinet
right,
ministers, that sort of thing had a lot of blowback, and also, it's in her overall um, effort to dealing with the problem was to take a page out of her father's book in convening the 21st century Panlong Agreement and finding ways to bring all um, the ethnic groups together. And by that, I mean the ethnic armed organizations, of course, who are the source of power or and their civilian arms, the force of soft power, and them the hard power, right? So bringing them all together. But the one thing that you know was was impossible from the get go, because you're not negotiating um, at an even level, You're a civilian government. You convene this peace dialogue. Now you have various ethnic groups with their various demands, and the government so in question is what specifically? Are you talking to the civilian government, or are you talking to the military? Because civilian government and military are not on the same page, nor have the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
voice. So is
Uh-huh.
the ethnic groups doing their own thing and making their own demands, but the military making its own counters, and sometimes it's getting up to leave the room. And then the civilian government, most times, playing the mediator in between, not knowing or having really a real say, right? If you're really talking about the core of it, a confrontation, a ground confrontation between two armed groups, what role specifically can the civilian government and with what authority can it play other than being a goodwill mediator, right? So those were the things that she encountered, and I think she performed poorly at the end of, if you do a reassessment of it, um, in her dealings with ethnic groups, many of whom felt betrayed by her overly Burma-centric approach at
Uh-huh.
defining local governance matters as. And large part of it I attribute to the inability to trust. It's about the people that she knows that she can trust, who don't always deliver in terms of capability, but she continued trusting anyways, and that was a flaw, and that affected her ability to deliver on some much needed wins for the country.
Hmm. Looking back on it now, do you think there's anything that she could have done better that could have possibly prevented a coup from taking place, or do you think that was always in the cards?
Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't, map out. But a part of me wonders if she had done more to cultivate her own fraction within the military, right? Her own
Mm,
support within the
mhm.
military, if this could have been averted. Um, I don't think she attempted that at all, to be honest. Nor she could have. I mean, again, the intricacies of real Naypyidaw power politics is limited to those who are exposed to it, and we, from glimpse and some degree of access we can, make assumptions and um, map things out all day long, but I don't think we'll ever capture the full picture. But yeah, by doing more to engage parts of the military, um, and so some degree of division within them would have, beat them at their own game kind of scenario would have been helpful, but I don't think it would have entirely averted it, to be honest. The the military on their part too made no attempt, right? So it's both sides did little to try to avert the situation, I think. And of course the victim here is the people of Myanmar and the
Yeah.
civilian government, and there's no question about it. And so the majority of the blame is with the perpetrator, that's the military. So that fact is unquestioned. I i don't know what she could have done differently to avert a coup, honestly. But to in from my perspective, right, just better governance on the NLD leadership's part would have been to be more stern with the more problematic elements of the party's leadership. Should have been more um, tactical and skill and deliverable based than mere patronage and loyalty, or alleged loyalty, based on personal power, personal personality politics. Sorry. So I think that was the main flaw, and those became the main culprits, the problems that sow a wider and wider divide between the military and the civilian government, because power as they knew it, even when they were jailed activists that protested against this very form of power from the beginning, power as they knew it was from the military's playbook. So when they got into a position of power, they exercised exactly like the individuals that they protested against. There were some elements of that NLD leadership that she and her circle of elders, if you will, could have cast out early on.
Yeah.
I think that would have sent a stronger message, but instead they protected them, and I think that sowed a lot of resentment and hatred among various stakeholders, which cannot have been helpful um,
Right.
to the entire process.
Now, another issue that was very important during the transition period was sanctions and investment, the releasing of sanctions to try to make a more investment friendly atmosphere and attracting investment, which, as we all know, was then derailed by not just the Rohingya crisis, but the way it was being handled and the uh, the outside views um, of that just became untenable prior to the coup. But in looking at this issue of investment, this is something that I believe of everything happening during the transition, you were most involved in and most had a stake in trying to play a role. So tell us what your views on at the time of investment opportunities were, the challenges, perhaps even some successes, if there's some things that come to mind, as well as what you were doing during that period as far as trying to attract investments was going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I was fortunate and honored to be part of various offering input on various legislation, including the Myanmar Investment Law, the Myanmar Companies Law, and the likes. And the key challenge was um, the transparency in policy making, right, which got really streamlined under the NLD, which we consider a very positive development. And another is capacity, of course. I mean, capacity of your average employee, capacity of the government employees, and the ability to carry out and enforce and all that. Corruption was entrenched and deeply rooted, as deeply rooted as the military as an institution in everyday walk of life, um, and but not limited to the military personnel. It was across the board, right? So dealing with that was another big challenge in itself. Um, and another would be the basic infrastructure elements. They just didn't have the baseline infrastructure, construction, bridges, electricity. All of those were general challenges, but there were also positives. We um, had openings to offer input and direct um, advice with ministerial level decision makers, right? And emerging technology scene, particularly in the SME, small and medium enterprises front, um, and local entrepreneurs that have emerged. So there's always reason for hope.
The sanctions were obviously very controversial in terms of whether to release them all or have something more gradual or selective. And then once the sanctions were in fact all lifted, then there was a rush for investment, but there were many problems um, with attracting that investment, and then the Rohingya crisis just kind of derailed all of that. And so the question is looking at first your view and assessment of that
Mm.
period, as well as whatever involvement you had in it, what you were trying to do, and what your hope was with it.
Well, okay, I can answer that. So sanctions as a tool of changing the behavior of a despotic regime, for instance, has never been helpful, and I'm a firm believer in that. And I know there are arguments against it, and I've read them all, but honestly, they have never been helpful. What in fact they end up doing is hurting the local economy and the people. And as someone who grew up seeing through many a pirated movie and CDs that what's out there, and knowing that you don't have the same access and who hunger for it, who wanted to have what my fellow global citizens, or at the very least my fellow ASEAN citizens have, I can tell you that it was not a good feeling to grow up with. Okay, and you will notice that a lot of people pushing for sanctions um, grew up in mostly developed Western countries and will have absolutely no idea the hardship that I'm talking about. So when it came the opportunity for me to advocate against sanctions, I vehemently I vehemently argued against the use of sanctions because of their impact. I mean, look, the military, especially in a resource-rich country like Myanmar, people with power and the military in this case will always find a way to line their own pockets. They the the matrix in which they determine governance are different from how the rest of the world sees governance. They are willing to strip the economy to its core, survive on own agricultural produce, and sell all resources, including gems and oil and teak and you name it, and continue to build up their security apparatus and their own network of wealth rooted around patronage at the cost of the entire population. They don't even think twice about that. Right? So the notion that inability to access the outside services and utilities and especially in the digital age, I mean, including software, um, cutting out the part of Myanmar's population that really needed to grow um, is in fact counterproductive, in my opinion. That said, um, what else is there, right? What else is there as an option? Really, I think our friends in the West, if they want to be effective in how they get involved, of course, the well, okay. Really, our friends in the West, they look at sanctions as a tool um, to check a box that something is and has been done as far as Myanmar is concerned. Uh, I don't necessarily see the impact of sanctions so much as a benefit to the average Myanmar citizen, but more so um, as a policy checklist for the rest of the developed world to say, okay, well, we're doing our part. Here's what we did. And that's my frank and honest observation. Now, there are many things that are done in tandem with um, that approach, right? Because you want to hurt the junta, and you want to help the people, and the helping people part of that component coming in the form of development aid, education initiatives, and funding for capacity building programs. All that stuff is positive and very welcome. Um, but honestly, I don't think sanctions are the answer. Nor has ever been.
Right. So then once the sanctions were eventually removed within the transition period, we started to see a real flow of investors looking for opportunities in Myanmar wanting to track investments. Tell us how that went from your vantage point.
Oh well, I mean, even if sanctions were lifted, you still had there wasn't so much really a period where Myanmar was entirely sanctions free. See, because
Uh-huh.
you had this little window in the early 2016, but then right around 2017 with the clearance operations in Rakhine,
Right, right.
military headed. Then we went right back into global Magnitsky, and then so the reputational or overall risk index for companies operating in
Uh-huh.
Myanmar hasn't changed. In fact, it hasn't changed at all.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
it's only the degree of, well, how bad is it, and is it less bad or worse, right? There's never a time where it's compliance clear, so to speak, just because the various nefarious activities in the drug and J trade, as well as in the humanitarian violations that continued through the NOD's role in office. So there was never a time where it was, you know, reputational risk free at the very least, right?
Right. So this conversation is all leading us more towards the present moment of looking at the coup which happened in 2021 and where we're at now. The stalemate that's currently going on, the violence, the egregious violation of human rights that are happening on a near daily level, the NUG and the resistance forces that are on the ground trying to resist the military. That's a lot to cover, and a very complicated, messy situation. So, where do you want to go with that? And looking at in charting this conversation we've had with you now, moving, I think, into the fourth hour of our talks together. Finally, getting into contemporary times and the current crisis, everything we've been talking about before as background leading up to this moment, um, in looking at the current crisis, where we're at, where we're going, where do you want to take that? What stands out for you that you'd like to leave the listeners with about this?
Well, it's a lot to unpack, but
Yes.
I'll try to keep it concise and to the point. First, I would look at the immediate future, right? So, in the immediate future, what are we looking at? What are our options? Um, the You are right. We are at a stalemate, and it doesn't seem like either side is going to um, compromise anytime soon. And talks of any kind seem far away at this time. But amidst it all, I think we need to take a step back and look at how the scope of conflict in Myanmar proper has changed. Really, the dissatisfaction towards the coup and the the fact of the fact that people's voice through their votes in the 2020 general elections were not honored um, was a wide display of dissatisfaction in the form of protest, initially peaceful, right? Millions out on the streets expressing their dissent over the military's coup. And that went on for a while until the military responded with deadly attacks um, and jailing and torture and killing of um, unarmed civilians. And quite different from the 88 scenario is that these images were all captured in the form of pictures, video, and instantly shared across all media platforms. The the movement had more names, more stories to affiliate with, and the lives of young children, and immediately within a matter of minutes, right, matter of hours or days, just posted and shared across the country. So
Yeah.
that really, the pain with this that came with this one is more profound, I think, on our younger generation. um, the military, as much as they may think that they can play the same rule book that was played throughout the 90s, but you need to understand that back then Myanmar was coming out of another dictatorship of Ne Win during the Cold War that similarly shielded the country from the rest of the Western world. And the degree of propaganda and misinformation that can be easily manipulated. Where this technology age goes beyond what the military leadership or their henchmen are really capable of, and that's the real problem. That's what makes this so different from the 88 revolution. So you look at that and you see the gradual transition of what initially was a, a protest, a rejection of um, this return to isolation and authoritarianism through, well, poetry and prose. That's how it started, really. I mean, you have, people. singing out on the streets, right? Signs
Right.
with flowers, with.
Yeah.
But when that was responded with such force, and the images of that response so deeply entrenched, especially in the younger generation,
Uh-huh.
um, that exploded. And now we're looking at the nature of the conflict and the nature of the protest turning the more armament route. And these younger generation folks picking up arms and saying, well, we'll have to, in order to get respectable response, you have to speak the only language the military understands.
Uh-huh.
That is through force, sheer
Uh-huh.
force. I once had a conversation with a former diplomat who was conveying to me a conversation he had with some military generals. And he said, uh, military men, um, how do you get a military man to, Myanmar military men to change their mind? And, well, you put a gun to their head.
Yeah.
But that's the nice words, and a gun to their head.
Uh-huh.
And the as he finished his little anecdote, another military man interrupted and said, "No, that doesn't cut it. You'd have to pull the trigger."
Jesus.
That's that's the thinking, right, among some of the more entrenched
Oh, yeah.
core military mindsets. It's a very
It's pretty
do or
dark.
die, victory and nothing else. That sort of mentality. So
Mhm.
um, the the nature of this, what initially was a peaceful protest turning violent, and is they this is their own doing, the military's own doing, by not taking people's voices and desires into account. um, I do worry that the mantra of our younger generation in their solving problems, instead of um, coming together through a meeting or melding of the minds, would be a more violent oriented route.
Mhm.
And that's something that we as a nation will have to um, figure out and cope with and heal together through all this trauma. So um, that's in the post, well, in the, I guess,
Right.
the rebuilding of the nation period to look
Right.
at. And but if it is the military's intention to roll the country back into a DPRK-esque form of isolation, strip it to the core,
Uh-huh.
agricultural products for survival, and purchase of weapons for security, that simply won't work. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? The people
Uh-huh.
have taken some semblance of freedom for the past 5 years, and there is nothing that can get in the way of them doing everything they can to try to get it back, including giving their own lives. And that's a fact. And that's a reality that the military needs to start including in their overall political math.
Mhm.
And I think they realize it too. I think they realize it too. That's why they're trying to figure out ways to find a face-saving off-ramp that still protects their interests, still protects their political power, um, because they know that they've gone too far with this one. And right now, uh, you know, no one's willing to get past the need for retribution in the negotiation. And that can be in the form of transnational justice if they are lucky, or a Gaddafi like ending where one punch from each individual at the town center, and you can barely
Mhm.
recognize the guy, right? So that the outcomes are becoming less and less um, narrower, I would say, narrower for the military with time. And the biggest um, deficit that they have right now is in the loss of their overall moral, if there was ever one, but let's just say ideological center. There's no longer a ideological base for military recruitment anymore, right? The whole rhetoric of defenders of the nation, um, saving the country from foreign interest, the xenophobia, the the that doesn't fly as much anymore. Not when the
Mhm.
military is, so blatantly killing civilians, their own kind, and including in central Myanmar, and and carpet bombing entire
Yeah.
civilian towns and villages. So that generation of what would normally be new military recruits turning to PDFs or joining, teaming up with ethnic armed groups, or if they don't want to go that route, simply just leaving the country. Just the outflow of young Burmese and all groups across Myanmar leaving the country to work, find education elsewhere is astounding over the past 3 years, right? In Thailand alone, you get an influx of 7+ million immigrants.
Do you see any indication that the military is looking for an off ramp and not just fully based on the mad accumulation and consolidation of power?
They have no choice but to look at an off ramp because it can be in the form of elections, so-called elections. And one of the predictions that I've heard was that they would wait out the mandate of the 2020 elections, which is supposed to be 5-year term. So in 2025, they would convene new elections, and but that would still, be considered ineligible, or um, would be considered, what's the term for? Oh, sorry, they would still be considered illegitimate by every sense of the word, right?
Mhm.
Uh, so, uh, but they know that this is not sustainable in the long run. I think that's part of the overall math.
Why do you think they know that? I certainly know that's one interpretation, but there's also, and that's definitely the way I think we rationally see it this time. But there also is a certain kind of power hungry madness that makes up being in the upper echelons of the military. To what degree do you think they're sharing the same analysis that we're discussing here?
The military is not good at a lot of things. They don't know a lot of things, especially if it comes to warfare, technology, or economics, as we have seen through time and time again. But the one thing that they do know is the military. They know their
Mhm.
military, and they know that the deficit in recruitment, deficit in the ideological propaganda that they spew not sticking with their core base anymore. That is their wake up call, right? That is a reminder that, okay, while this may work for now, this is not sustainable in the long run. And we're looking at 10 years, 20 years of, say, more deficit in recruitments. And what is, you're also looking at what is the baseline for uh, power that you're incentivizing people with, for their hold on power that you're incentivizing people with, is the ability right now is simply the ticket to, rampage, conduct any activities with impunity, illegal activities with impunity. And this is the darker side of a very already very dark military. Drugs among its own servicemen, right?
Mhm.
And the utilization of drugs among its servicemen, and to either continue to do what they do, and um, or to simply function, right? And then they become dependent, and need to be reliant on it to maintain. They know that it is not sustainable because no one knows the military more than the military itself. And that's why I think, with time, y- they would be looking at off ramps that does not continue in this same direction, way in direction. Uh, th- Another factor to consider, of course, is also China. Right? China is a very important player here,
Sure.
with,
Yeah.
the hold that they have on
Mhm.
uh, the various ethnic groups in the borders, especially their borders, and their supply of weapons, ammunition, and financial uh, support to these organizations. So they have a lot of say in how they operate and when they operate. So the I think it, it started off during, well, it has been boiling since the SPDC era, but it really took off during the Thein Sein administration. Is within the military itself a discontentment towards being so subservient towards the Chinese, and
Mhm.
that's always been the part of the military mantra,
Right.
and Mail Online shares that sentiment. Uh, and he has, said it publicly, and I've heard from private anecdotes of people conveying that his outlook towards the Chinese is, one that is shared among the military, which is that they don't like being pushed around, they don't like being bullied. I mean, again, these are, you have to
Yeah.
understand, these are, tough, well, men acting tough with very fragile egos. And
Yeah.
when they're being pushed around, or when they feel that they're being pushed around by the Chinese, they don't appreciate it. So having to continue so you'll notice that during the Thein Sein era, the stand up for setting up to cancel missile and canceling the Lebanon copper mine, all those major Chinese projects was a signal that,
Mm.
hey, we don't take orders from you. We have the West too. We'll balance you. You'll see that sort of
Mhm.
thinking,
Mhm.
which at that time gained tremendous support and popularity within the military. Well, that's how I, look at this, right? And probably why Myanmar's first call was in, a strong man like Putin, even though it made little geopolitical and strategic sense, as opposed to running straight to Xi or or any Chinese leadership for that matter, right?
Mhm.
Because of that prevailing military sentiment. So depending on how deep or how uh, much they have to give away in concessions to the Chinese politically and economically, I think that'll play a big factor. And the overall growth of the revolutionary forces. I don't see that dying down anytime soon. While things may have returned to a semblance of normalcy in the metropolis such as Yangon and Mandalay and to some degree, well, Naypyidaw never been a metropolis, but
Yeah.
uh,
Right.
Naypyidaw is the capital, so I'll include Naypyidaw as well for what it's
Mm.
worth.
Mhm.
Um, and Naypyidaw, but everywhere else, there are attacks ongoing every day. Um, there are at least 400 to 500 attacks expected. Okay, there are at least 400 to 500 attacks that took place over this month alone, and it's the rainy season right now.
Mhm.
So you can imagine, with the capability and sophistication and degree of these revolutionary forces gaining ground, and then you have a declining morale and ideological center within the military, and it's all about, a kleptocracy really is what it's turned into. Is take whatever you can while you have the
Yeah.
power
Yeah.
mentality. How are you going to keep that sustainable? It is. It seems obvious because, well, obviously, we're not supporters of the military and we'd like to see Myanmar return to civilian, but think of it from a military strategic perspective too. I have no doubt that they have internal estimates and calculations of how long they can sustain this. And in line with that timeline, they will try to deliver on a face saving off ramp. That is my prediction.
You seem cautiously hopeful.
I have nothing but hope, Joe. Because if
Mm,
I have
so
hope, I have
mm,
nothing else. Oh, sorry. If I don't have hope, I have nothing else.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot to take in, and just one last question with that. We're talking about the near future and how this will play out in a more short-term scenario. One of the common topics that have come in many of our interviews, whether we're talking with someone from the energy sector, education, the economy, investment, whatever it is we're looking at, one of the whatever perspective people are coming in with, I've heard a very familiar refrain, consistent refrain that's come, and that's that this notion that even if the democracy were to come back tomorrow and the military would go away, whatever this sector or this perspective is we're looking at, we're not talking about suddenly magically going back to how things were in the transition, which, as we know, were not perfect to begin with. But in many of these sectors, people are expressing concern that what the coup has done, what this period of conflict has done, has set these things back decades, even a generation, depending on what it is they're looking at. So, th- yeah, as we assuming that in some future year, the military does find its off ramp and we go through another version of the transition period, what can you say in a general way of the immense challenges that are going to be facing the country and the people in terms of what extent this current period of conflict has just set everything back just decades, even perhaps to the last century? What are those challenges that well well will have to be faced for the next leadership?
I'll start that off by saying that never underestimate the resiliency of the Myanmar people.
Nice, nice, I like
We
that.
have survived
Right.
more than what the rest of the calculating world would otherwise have written off as, how do you recover from that? And we have
Yeah,
recovered.
yeah.
So, we've
Mhm.
seen, well, I don't think we've seen worse, but we've seen pretty bad stuff, right?
Yeah,
And we've
yeah,
lived through it and we've survived it. So, number one, do not estimate that. Number two, every, the transition, as it were, was unique based on the circumstances at that time, right? We're looking at
mhm,
a whole new variable of circumstances and um, levers of power in play in this current scenario, which is going to develop into a new scenario by the time they'll be ready to speak. So I think it would be naive of me to imagine or talk about a future in which the Myanmar military is no longer a major stakeholder at the table.
sure.
That will always be the case. And as I said earlier, you're not going to drive a 250 or whatever 300,000 troop armed group into the Andaman Sea. That's not going to happen. So, for what it's worth, and for better or worse, we got to figure out a way to um, coexist. We got to figure out a way to coexist in a way that the military's future role does not have one of major political or economic prominence. And
Mhm.
the trade-offs that you'd have to do, including on transnational justice and all that, will be a tough nut to crack, especially because there's so much personal cost and um, emotion, myself included, right? Um,
Yeah.
and I'm trying to be I'm trying to be the more pragmatic, rational voice here, but even then, the personal toll and
Yeah, yeah.
toll that it has taken on the broader populace is it will be very difficult uh, to go back to that scenario where we can coexist. I don't think it would be easy to forgive and forget. Maybe forgive, but to forget, I mean, generations. It would be very
Mhm,
difficult for that.
mhm.
That said, all those that uh, I'll tell you this: a lot of at the very opening, a lot of Burmese educated abroad, making good income and on a career trajectory that are promising by international global standards, many dropped whatever they were doing and ran back home to serve, to be part of any opening capacity that they can.
Mhm, mhm,
And it's despite how long you've been away that is built into us, I think. And I
mhm,
still have faith in that base of
mhm,
young, educated Burmese who would much rather be utilizing the education and their know-how for the development of their own country as opposed to whichever is their say adopted countries at this time.
uh-huh,
So for that I have hope in. And as to how we carve out a role to coexist for the military, for them to be able to coexist, um, perhaps a page out of Indonesia's playbook. I've always thought was something that we could learn from. There is still some degree of political and economic power, but that doesn't interfere with the power mechanisms of the government in charge, right? The civilian government is still, um, in control of the military to some degree. That's necessary and important. And I right now, um, you know, I think only time will tell whether um, we can come to that degree of solution. I don't want to say compromise because it means someone's giving up something, right? So I
Mhm.
would say solution, mutually beneficial solution. It is um, going to be very difficult. Going to be very difficult, teetering on the impossible. But as I said earlier, if I don't have hope, I have nothing.
Mhm.
And at least in my lifetime, I think we will see a return to the promise that Myanmar once showed the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sitting down with us for this time and sharing those views. There's a lot there, and really appreciate being able to have this conversation with you.
Likewise, Joa. Thanks for making the time.
Many listeners know that in addition to running these podcast episodes, we also run a nonprofit, Better Burma, which carries out humanitarian projects across Myanmar. While we regularly post about current needs and proposals from groups on the ground, we also handle emergency requests, often in matters that are quite literally life or death. When those urgent requests come in, we have no time to conduct targeted fundraisers, as these funds are often needed within hours. So please consider helping us to maintain this emergency fund. We want to stress that literally any amount you can give allows us to respond more flexibly and effectively when disaster strikes. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Watabayaran kaya unya na dadu ya dalam dia digane zat mana we kada besayana besayo. Oba yaran anda da yaran ngan na yaran ya da yaran poda ba yaran